So we're going to continue, and today we're talking about the Fourth Ecumenical Council. And this council took place in Chalcedon in the year 451. And it is the origin of the first great schism of the church. Many times we grew up hearing about the Great Schism, which was between Rome and Constantinople, and became the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But this council, 451, actually was the first schism. The Fourth Ecumenical Council dealt primarily with the nature of Christ. And we, as we know it in today's understanding, we believe that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man. He has a full divine nature and a full human nature. Never, and that's because of this council, never was he not divine and not human. He always had his full divinity and full humanity. And that's why we talk about the two natures of Christ. That's why we do our cross like this. Remember, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, fully man, the two natures of God. However, there were many in the church who believed that God had one nature. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to our contemporary world. The ones who left the church in Chalcedon, were for many years called Monophysites, because they believed in one nature. We believe in two natures. And the raging debate, and finally the church split. And we know the other church, we call it the Oriental Orthodox Church today. It's the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Armenian Church, the Indian Church, etc., right? The Oriental Orthodox Church. And all of those have that one element in common. They did not agree with the bishops at Chalcedon about the natures of Christ. Now, here is the difficulty. In our contemporary understanding, we now know that both sides were saying the same thing back then. But it was being lost in the nuances of culture and in the nuances of translation. What the Oriental Orthodox Church was saying was that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man, but has one unique God-man nature, which is fully God and fully man. And so that's really saying the same thing we are saying, in that God is fully divine and fully human. But in the natural human limitations of life, in the year 451, we were not able to come to that full understanding. Put on top of that, we cannot ignore that there were already political strugglings within the empire. And this group, the Oriental Orthodox Church, also found itself leaving and departing from the empire. So there was both a political and a theological debate going on. And as we know, being weak human beings, sometimes we have troubles allowing the political things to stay aside. And so in the year 451, basically, we have the first schism of Christianity. And today we know that as the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox Church. And from that time, there are many things, unfortunately, if we're being honest, many negative things said about each other throughout the centuries. Of course, remember, they're sharing geography and things like that. Now, fast forward to today, we have an international dialogue commission, committee, whatever you want to call it, and they have already agreed that we're saying the same thing. And so the question is, how do we reunite after all of these centuries? I like to remind people again of the human nature of the church. we can't just flip a light switch and pretend that 1600 years of history didn't exist. They have their saints, we have our saints in that time, and especially the saints around that time period, calling each other heretics, because that was their understanding. So now imagine if we are reunited, now they are expected to accept saints that call them heretics. It's not a simple light switch. So by God's grace, I do believe that we will reunite probably fairly soon, especially because of the current geopolitical world is fighting against the Orthodox, and I think we will find it beneficial to finally be able to move beyond what the International Committee says and actually finally reunite. But this is it. So this happened at this council, the natures of Christ. So we now know that Jesus Christ has always been divine and always been human. And that was the important theology at this particular council. And the reason that's important, so let's move on beyond the schism. The reason it's important for us is because there are, for us today in 21st century, there are Christian churches today that are struggling with this exact topic of the divinity of Christ. Specifically, the debate in many Western churches is, when did Jesus Christ become divine? They struggle to believe that he was always divine, that he was divine from the moment of conception in his mother's womb. And why do they feel that way? Because they have a struggle comprehending that the divine God would die. That the divine God, how could God die? And so part of the debate that goes on is, was there a time that maybe the divinity left Jesus and left him as a man? Or was there a time where the divinity came and left? Did he start human in his mother's womb and maybe took on the divinity after birth? And this, of course, is an anathema in the church, because we believe, as we said last week, Theotokos, that she is the bearer of God, and so that Jesus Christ is always divine and always human. And that's why we call it a mystery. We don't know how God accomplishes those things, but we see it every day, and you're going to see it today when you receive Holy Communion. When you receive Holy Communion as a mystery of God, it's going to be fully bread and fully wine, while at the same time being fully God. And so in the Holy Communion, we have the continual mystery of the natures of God. It's still going to taste like bread and wine, but it's the body and blood of Christ at the exact same time. And so this is one of the things that we talk about in the church, how our theology is constantly being a part of our life. So we reinforce this reality of the natures of God, and that's why when Christ says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And he says, I am the bread of life. Right? And so we have that reality of the natures of Christ even present in Holy Communion. And so when we receive Holy Communion, we are not only reminded of that truth of Jesus Christ, but we are, in a way, reaffirming it to the world. Right? Every now and then I get, I should say not every now and then, fairly often I am presented with the question about people who are not Orthodox receiving communion in the Orthodox Church, and we don't allow it. We don't allow people who are not Orthodox Christians to receive communion in our church, nor do we allow ourselves to receive communion in another church. We can't go to the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church or the Methodist Church and receive Holy Communion. Only in the Orthodox Church. And that's because of these theological truths. So, the reason we're studying these councils, and of course, like all the councils, there's administrative canons in there too that we're not going to bother with today, but as we study these councils, these common themes come up, right? Have you noticed the common pattern? What is the common pattern of all these dogma arguments? What's the common pattern? Who has figured it out?
Are they all God?
All about God, but be more specific.
The nature of Jesus.
It's all about Jesus Christ. Think about that. All of these councils, these theological arguments, were the common thread is, who is Jesus Christ? Right? So the first couple of councils talked about the Trinity. Then the third council it looks like it's about the Panagia, it looks like it's about the Virgin Mary, but it's about Christ. Because the name we gave to her is a reflection on him. Right? So here we are today, the fourth council, and again, who is Jesus Christ? And so when it comes to Holy Communion, people say to me, but I believe Jesus Christ is in the chalice, why can't I receive communion? Let's say they're Lutherans, and Lutherans do believe communion is really Jesus Christ. My response is, what do you believe about Jesus Christ? What do you believe to be true about him? Because that's also present in the Holy Chalice. If someone believes that Jesus Christ was not always divine and not always human, then we don't believe the same thing about Jesus Christ. How can we take communion together? Even if we believe Jesus Christ is in the chalice. You see, that's why these meetings are so important. They're not just historical events. It wasn't just a whole bunch of bishops getting together and saying, let's come up with some rules. Yes, every church needs some rules. The first rule is, I'm the most important bishop. No, they didn't do that. They talked about the importance of who God is and who Jesus Christ is. Because he's our Savior. And the one thing you're going to notice, the more you study about the church, the common thread of Jesus Christ is in all of the doctrines, all of the dogmas of truth of God. Whether or not this bishop goes to that city and this bishop goes to that city, all those things can be changed. But what cannot be changed is the truth about God. Because, and this is something that makes us, I think, foreign in the contemporary world. Truth is not relative. Truth is truth. There's no such thing as your truth and my truth. But that is the trend in the contemporary world. You have your truth, I have my truth. Then it isn't truth, either one. And that's why the church reminds us of these things. The truth about God, because it is truth, can never change. Now, the things around it, how we respond to that truth, those things come and go through the centuries. There are many canons in this book that the church no longer enforces. Some I sometimes think we should, but that's above my pay grade, right? But these natures, these divinities, these truths about God are what's important. And that's why Father Samson and I have decided that history is important. Notice we haven't been talking about the history of borders and things like that, but the history of understanding God's truth. Any questions? Yes.
So in the Fourth Council, the Western Roman Church was part of the Orthodox communion
Yes.
in terms of understanding the nature
Yes.
of Christ.
Yes, the Roman Church was still with us.
So the Protestant churches that they only broke away from the Western Church. So like you say the
Okay.
Lutherans, for example. So could they not have taken that? They have other issues that
Yeah,
that are
so
different from us.
I think I understand your question.
The dual nature of Christ.
I'm not an expert on what they do believe.
Okay.
However, in the Protestant world, there's another common denominator. All things Roman are bad. And so there's a trend in the Protestant movement, because everything is, the word protest, you're protesting. So the common pattern is, well, if you've got it, it must be bad. And what you see in the Protestant, and again, these are broad strokes, right? The further away you get from Martin Luther, right, the first Protestant, the further away you get, more temporary, the less and less sacramental the Protestant church is, right? Lutherans still have the sacraments like we have. Methodists still have the sacraments like we have. But you move further and further and you get fewer and fewer sacraments, because they're shedding more and more of that part of their history. Now, does that mean that they may not somehow believe some of the things we believe? Of course they do. Some churches still say the creed as we do. Not all churches read the creed as the filioque, like we've talked about. So that's but as of 2015, a study by Gordon Conwell Seminary, 45,000 denominations of Christianity. And that was as of 2015. 45,000. Now, Orthodoxy is one denomination in their survey. Roman Catholicism is one denomination in their survey. 45,000 different denominations in the Christian world. And what's the common theme? They all believe something different about Jesus Christ. Okay? Yes? Speak up, speak up.
There are 4 archdioceses, or patriarchs.
Okay,
But I've heard there's 5 patriarchs.
okay.
Because Rome and Constantinople are...
Right. So there were 5 ancient patriarchs: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. When Rome leaves, that leaves the 4 behind. Maybe that's where the 4 is coming from. There's 4 in the east and 1 in the west. And so the other thing that we notice, even before Rome actually left the church, because of the great geographical distance, it was much easier for the Eastern Church to communicate. The bishops weren't tweeting back and forth. They weren't getting on their Instagram and showing selfies with all the other bishops. They had to wait sometimes years before the information actually made its way into the various towns and villages throughout the Christian world. And the 4 patriarchs in the East were much closer together. Imagine, it's a huge journey to go all the way to Rome. It's not so bad to go from Antioch to Jerusalem, right? Or up to Constantinople. So that's a part of that as well. We never, and I hope you understand this from me and from Father Samson, we don't hide our history, right? We are a church that is a living truth. These truths that these councils lay out for us is our never-changing foundation. And then we walk the steps of life within that reality. And every year the world throws something different at us. Every generation the world deals with a different struggle and deals with a different thing. And so the church always goes back to its roots and says, how are we going to address these things? right? And that's why that council in Crete was so important a few years ago, because it was taking the contemporary challenges of the church and going back to the original understanding of truth and figuring out how we could address some of these more contemporary issues. How are we on time?
According to my clock, it's 12 till.
According to your clock, it's 12 till. So that means we have 2 minutes for questions. That's correct. Okay, so there's an interesting thing so there's the Coptic Church cannot receive communion in our church, and nor can we receive communion in their church. So the question is about burial. The easiest answer is the funeral service is for members of the church. Okay? I do have an opportunity that I've done, for example, only twice in my life, where non-members of the church had no one to do any kind of prayer for them or what have you. And so there's an opportunity. I have a special prayer. Now, none of my vestments are on. It's not a service of the church. I am just a man doing a prayer. And that's how I would deal with people outside of the church who have absolutely nobody. But that's a very rare, especially in the 21st century. There's at least 4 Coptic churches, at least 4 Oriental churches in Tampa Bay that I know. So it'd be almost impossible for someone in Tampa Bay not to find an Oriental priest. Yeah. Last question, anybody?
Well, you had mentioned earlier that the several different denominations and we all believe in the same thing, and that is the reason why we can't have communion in the other churches. So, but what are the oldest ones, obviously, being Roman Catholic and Orthodox, am I right?
Well, if you include this schism, the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox are the original two, yeah.
Okay. So, but in the end, what are the big differences that separates us if we all believe in the same truth that God is both human and divine?
Well, that's a good question. So you're trapping me now, not on purpose, I know. The question is, what are the big differences? And that's becoming more and more difficult to say. 50 years ago, for example, for those of you who are old enough to remember, 50 years ago, we were actually closer to the Episcopalian Church than the Roman Catholic Church. That's no longer the case, by the way. Okay, and so over the years, things have changed in terms of the understanding of God and the Trinity and what have you. So it's not a very easy question to say, what are the big things? We know, for example, that the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church, and that includes the Oriental Church in this case, because the Roman Church added the filioque to the creed, we do not understand the Trinity the same way. And that right there is a foundational thing to who we are. So if we don't believe in the same understanding of the Trinity, then that's a foundational gap that has to be mended somehow. This thing, like I said, between the Oriental and the Eastern Orthodox, that's a pretty big difference, the natures of Christ, which is why for 1,600 years we've been apart. However, we now know in retrospect that we were saying the same thing the whole time, and now we're in that process of healing. So I'll give you a really good example of how that's experienced. A Coptic priest can come into this church, cannot go into the altar, but can come here and do a wedding from here. We do allow the Coptic priest to come into the church to do a wedding, for example, but they are not allowed to go into the altar. That is a recognition of that we're in that understanding, we're in that process of reunification with the Oriental Church. They can do a wedding here, but he cannot go into the altar, for example. Yeah. Okay, that was a good final question, so I appreciate that.